Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. In this video, we're going to debunking Bill Warner, the PhD Jihad versus Crusades. And he wants to outline to say that Jihad, the Islamic Ottoman Empire, was more of an aggression to take over the world, and he tries to say that the Crusades were nothing like that, and he gives us an animation and he misrepresents the Islamic position. Let's listen to his diatribe and we'll debunk him, God willing.
Whenever you're dealing with an apologist for Islam or even a Muslim and you bring up jihad, almost immediately they kick back to you. Well, what about those terrible crusades? Why, they're the moral justification for jihad. I mean, we're just as bad as they are, so let's not talk about jihad, okay? Let's talk about the crusades. Well, what I would like to talk about here are facts. And it turns out I sat down and put together some work and I created a database of some 548 battles that Islam fought, jihad battles against classical civilization. And these aren't even all the battles. It really doesn't say much about Africa and India, Afghanistan and all that. It's primarily the battles against the classical civilization of Rome and Greece. So, 548 battles is a lot, and it's too much to even comprehend. So I created something which I call a dynamic battle map, in which you have a display of the Mediterranean, and a white dot means that this 20-year period, that's a new battle. So every time the screen changes, it's 20-year period. The colors white turn to red, and so you can see a history. This may seem a little confusing, but I think when you see it, you'll know exactly what I mean. And here it starts. Islam burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and immediately starts attacking the Middle East. And notice that it doesn't take long until they're crossing the Mediterranean and attacking southern France and Spain.
Let's just pause it there for a minute. Notice how he's talking about attacking. He shows a map and he just shows there's an attack. Now, because there's a growth in Islam, it doesn't mean there's an automatic attack. Okay? Now, does Mr. Bill Warner even mention the possibility that the aggressors were actually the Romans and the Persians and so forth? Yes, that is a possibility. And so what Bill Warner doesn't do is he doesn't say that who actually initiated the conflict and why the conflict was initiated. Just because Islam spread, that could mean that it spread because it won public opinion and the minds. You see, if Bill Warner wants to show a consistency, then the consistency should be remarkable for all countries. But we don't see that. For example, when Islam went to Indonesia, when Islam went to the Philippines and so forth, and it passed through all of those South Asian countries and so forth, it was through the merchants, the business dealings. So when this person says, oh, look, it spread, all these green flanks have spread all over Europe, and this proves that it was just by jihad. Not necessarily. It could be public opinion after wars have ended. It could be merchants, business dealings and dawah. So basically, when he draws a map and shows this whole spread and conflates it to all killing and jihad, this is actually wrong. And in fact, if it is about fighting, let's say it is about fighting, Bill Warner must prove that it was the Muslims who are actually the aggressors at the very beginning. But he doesn't even discuss that. He just draws lines on the maps and points out where wars become and where wars have lost. I think that is a disrespectful, misconstrued proposition he's making towards history when there are many other factors that could have taken place. Let's continue.
Notice something here. Most people think of Islam, they think of Arabs, they think of desert, and yet here we see that Islam is projecting power throughout the Mediterranean. Notice how the little islands of the Mediterranean are getting hammered. The navy of Islam.
Again, he's saying hammered, but like I said, that could have been spread by dawah. No, it was so just because there's a spread of Islam, it doesn't mean, it could mean there was public opinion after the war. They won, for example, Hagia Sophia, for example, when it was taken over, there were many conflicts even between Christian sects fighting over that particular mosque, church at the time. And of course, people say, oh, look, it's the Muslims who took over Hagia Sophia. It converted those Christian churches. But no, actually, those Christians actually accepted Islam. Okay, and basically they could have said, well, we no longer want it to be our church anymore. We want it to now become a mosque because obviously we're now predominantly Muslim. And that's how it could have converted into a mosque. So basically, when Islam spreads over and there's intermingling between different faiths, people accept it. So just because there's an expanse, it doesn't mean it was every single person had a sword hold to their throat saying you need to make the testimony of faith. So Bill Warner gives this complete disregard and misrepresentation of how it was spread.
Islam would attack coastal towns, kill, rob, rape, and then take slaves.
There you go. So there you go. Kill, rob, robbery. Apparently, I mean, he says it's rob, but then Islam says you have to cut the hand of a thief, right? And then he talks about rape. Again, does he even quote any references where all these Europeans were robbed and they were taken as slaves and so forth? I mean, his white history took slaves, took them in the slave trades. I mean, we can discuss towards the end of the video how the Europeans actually spread throughout history. I mean, this is just remarkable.
So this whole battle map, as it unfolds, you're seeing slaves being taken. Over 1 million slaves were taken out of Europe into the Islamic world. That's something you don't think about much, but it's absolutely true.
It's absolutely true because he conflates slaves with concubines. You know, you go to war. Of course, Islam didn't have this prison system, this infrastructure where they could put everyone in prison. Obviously, they took concubines. This was part of war, was part of Western war as well. But he wants to conflate colonial slaveryism to Islamic slaveryism, which is completely different. And there are many hadiths, and I can put a hyperlink below this video, where your slaves are supposed to be treated like your brothers. And after the war, you're supposed to release the concubines, part of the war treaty and so forth. The Quran, in fact, commands to release slaves and free slaves. But then again, see, he's completely butchering history and conflating everything. It's just remarkable.
There were over 200 battles fought in Spain alone. And we also see, however, on the east coast in Turkey, that Islam is trying to break into Europe. Now, what's going to happen is, in Spain, this ongoing fight that lasted for 400 years, the Christians are going to push back the Muslims. But now then what has happened over in the east is that Constantinople has fallen, and now then Eastern Europe is getting hammered. The Jihad...
Okay, don't forget when he says that the Christian Crusades are now going to do a defensive, okay? Don't forget these words. When the Muslims went to Cordoba, they brought enlightenment, peace, and in fact opened universities after universities. They were accepted by the people, okay? It was the Muslim Renaissance. It was just amazing. It was, in fact, the Jews were actually protected by the Muslims. When the Crusaders came into Spain, into Cordoba, they actually murdered everyone, Muslims, Jews, you name it. And in fact, the Jews were either told to convert to Christianity or to be deported. And that's why most of the Jews in Spain had to actually seek asylum either in Turkey or in other parts of Europe, and of course in the Middle East and so forth. So this is the Christian Crusader, apparently defensive Christian Crusader, Bill Warner is apparently talking about.
Now comes to Eastern Europe. It's pushed out now of Spain. Northern Africa is now completely Islamic. The Middle East is completely Islamic.
And what does pushed out mean? Do you notice what pushed out means? See, his Jesus apparently teaches him to turn the other cheek. Yet he's talking about pushed out. What does pushed out mean? Well, what pushed out means, folks, is that those Christians who actually converted to Islam through interaction and dawah, and it wasn't necessarily jihad, right? And they had their mosques, these Christians who actually were Muslims, and they had their mosques. You know what pushed out means? That those Christians actually destroyed those actual Islamic mosques that the ex-Christians had, and they became Muslim, right? And they were exterminated, butchered, destroyed, wiped out. This is exactly what we saw in, for example, in Sarajevo, what the Christians did there with the Bosnian Muslims, destroyed them, ransacked them, humiliated them, raped them. These are the Christian crusaders, yeah? Oh, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh, they're secularists, it's got nothing to do with religion. Oh, damn right. If that was a Muslim army, you would have said it had everything to do with Islam. But when a Christian does it, oh, it's not about Christianity. But look, he even admits it. Mr. Bill Warren admits it. He says they were pushed out. They were pushed out of there. Can you imagine? What does pushed out mean? They were killed, murdered, raped, their mosques burnt down. This is what he means by pushed out.
This is all jihad, relentless jihad. And why is it so relentless? Well, Muhammad was relentless in his jihad. And these people are good students of Islam, and so it's against the
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, fight those who persecute you. This is what he says in the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad said in his letter to Saint Catherine, do not destroy their churches. Do not kill the men, women, and children. Do not kill the monks. Do not denigrate or desecrate their houses of worship. This is what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught. Yet what we see is the Christian crusaders do the opposite. They destroyed. I have a friend who actually visited parts of Bulgaria, parts of Macedonia, Romania, and he tells me that there were so many mosques that have been destroyed. You could see remnants of it destroyed, and he visited those places. So when he talks about desecration and destruction and Prophet Muhammad's behavior, we see the complete contrary what the Prophet Muhammad taught and what the Christian crusaders did in their advancements, as he says, to push out the Muslims. It wasn't pushing out Muslims, it was killing Muslims who actually accepted Islam.
Kafir, on and on. It was traditional that when the Sultan came to power, the brand new Sultan, he would immediately try to launch new wars because he was going to be noted in his Islamic history as to how well he fought against the Kafir.
Again, absolutely, he does not cite any references to this to say, oh, he wanted to take over the world and put a name for himself. He doesn't even cite any references to that. So he just speaks without even quoting a reference. And people believe it. He's got 1.8 million views. So this is, when people want convenient lies, they can find it. It's really easy. But when he asks for proof, he doesn't even show that. And the man says that I will present the facts. Yet you go through the description and he doesn't even provide any facts to his statement.
So that's what the jihad looked like over that time period, 548 battles. But remember, when you bring up jihad, people want to bring up the Crusades. So I also prepared a dynamic battle map of all the offensive raids of the Crusaders. Let's watch it and make a comparison.
All right, let him do the comparison and watch how he gets debunked on that too.
And so it begins. The Crusades enter into Turkey and the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Battles go on, but aren't there far fewer than you thought there might?
Oh, okay. So there were only far few of them. They went to Turkey. Remember, look what he says. He says Islam spread from that area, Saudi Arabia, but look what Christian Crusades did. They went into Turkey to fight and win those places.
It be. And here we go. The last battles are fought, and that is the end of the crusade.
Notice what he says. That is the end of the crusade. No, it's not the end of the crusade. Let's continue.
So now then we can talk about some facts.
Well, you know what the facts are, mister? I'll tell you what the facts are. The Crusades didn't end there. Just because a person doesn't call it a crusade, it doesn't mean it's not a crusade. The Christians from the Middle Eastern area, they spread all over Europe. They spread all over Europe. And they fought wars. They did what they had to do. And their extension grew so much that they even went to the rest of the globe. And here is the proof. Okay, so this is what a British empire, colonial empire, looks like on the map. As you can see, they have expanded all the way from Saudi Arabia to England to North America. They went to parts of South America, South Africa. They went to Australia. They went to India. And they continued their spread. They lost some areas. They went to even parts of and even Philippines. They went, and even the Americans came into the Philippines and the Spanish and so forth. And they would invade those areas that were Muslim and so forth. And they spread to the rest of the globe. You can see that the British have invaded 90% of the world's countries. This is by Richard Seymour from The Guardian. And you could see, and I know what someone will say. They'll say, oh, they weren't Christian. That had nothing to do with Christianity. They weren't the Crusades, blah, blah, blah. Yet they were Christians. They weren't atheists. And if there were very less, because the Christians didn't condemn these moves. When the Christians came to Australia, Mr. Bill Warner, they didn't say, okay, we're not building our churches here, did they? They clearly evangelized Australia, South Africa. They divided most of North Africa. They went into America and built their churches there through colonial wars, which made millions and millions of deaths, raped millions and millions of people in the process, enslaved millions and millions of people. This is all done by the hand of the colonials. So when Mr. Warner wants to make the argument, oh, the colonials, oh, the Crusades, they just went to Turkey and they went to little parts of Egypt or whatever it was. No, that isn't the case, Mr. Warner, because they spread their Christianity to the rest of the world and they did it through wars. Now, if you want to call it colonialism, I don't care whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day, behind them were the Christians, and these Christians had a particular motive to go to those new foreign lands and establish Christianity and build their churches and take over those lands. Whether it's right or wrong, they took those lands. If Islam did that, if the Muslims did that, and they didn't call it jihad, they called it colonial, you wouldn't accept that. You'd still say, oh, it's not just colonial, it's jihad. It was the Muslims that came to Australia. It took over the indigenous people and built their mosques here. That's what you would say. You'd say it's the Muslims. It's the Seljuks that did this, wouldn't you? So why the double standards?
Go on, but aren't there far fewer than you thought there might be? And here we go. The last battles are fought, and that is the end of the crusade.
No, that's not clearly the end. Stop lying, Mr. Warner. Stop misrepresenting Christian crusade that advented, especially through colonialism. You are an absolute liar.
Yes, there were crusades, but notice they ended centuries ago, and jihad is being practiced today.
They ended hundreds of years ago. Yes, they ended hundreds of years ago. You know, when America, the Bush administration, went into Iraq, they actually distributed Bibles. 70 to 80% of the American army is actually made up of devout Christians. This is according to experts, Western analysts. So these crusaders went there, they actually blew mosques, they converted many people, and they distributed Bibles secretly. This was documented. Let me show you a documentary, and you can listen to the documentary below this video, and I'll put a hyperlink and you can see for yourself. So notice the Crusades aren't over, Mr. Bill Warner. They're actually dressed as something modern and presented, not crusade, but presented as New Age Christian militia. That's what it is, undercover, working for the secularists, distributing Bibles throughout the whole Middle East, bombing those places. That's clear Christian crusader, my friend. Let's listen to him.
Has been with us for 1,400 years. There is no comparison between jihad and the Crusades. Certainly not a moral comparison.
Oh no, not a moral comparison. When your Christian friends came over to Australia and enslaved the people and raped the indigenous community and enslaved them and put them in chains. Oh, of course, there's no moral comparison here, no. And of course, what you did to those poor Americans and raped more than 60 million Native Americans and took over them and raped their children and so forth. Oh, of course, there's no moral comparison. What you did to the poor Africans with the slave trade. No, of course, no moral comparison there. No, of course not.
And when you're looking at the Crusades, remember, in one sense, all of the Crusades were defensive wars. Why? Well, as we saw on the first Jihad map, it was...
Oh, yes, they were defensive crusades. Yes, of course, they were defensive crusades. Oh, yes, the Australian native people, it was a defensive war that they were fighting when an invading ship, that funny-looking ship, and that captain rocked up with that funny-looking hat and said, "This is my country now." That's all a defensive crusade. Your colonial history is a defensive crusade, yes.
Islam that came out of Arabia and conquered the Middle East.
In fact, there's an academic report written by another individual, and I'll show you that link, that even in the Middle East, it wasn't even a defensive crusade. It was a clear pushback and killed many of the Muslims who actually converted from Christianity. These Christians reverted to Islam and they were happy practicing their faith. And like you said, it was a pushback. So again, it wasn't a defensive crusade. And in fact, it actually says in the report, and I'll post the report for you to see, the report says that, and here is the link. This guy here, his name is Jay Rubenstein. He's actually an academic historian. And he argues about the myths being a crusade. And he says, were they a defensive war? And he argues that this is clearly false. He goes on to say, but let me apply to this problem the same question that I asked earlier about the Crusades. As a clash of civilization, did the Crusades view their war in these terms? Was it a defensive war? He says, listen to this bit, he says, the answer is a sounding no. The Crusades had one goal in 1096 to capture the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of the Christ in Jerusalem. Christianity at this time was less about ideas and more about things, places, objects, and bones. The highest devotional practices was the pilgrimage, a journey to a holy site to pray before the body of saints. The model saint whom all others imitated was Christ, and his tomb was the most sacred one imaginable, even though, unlike other saints' shrines, Christ was empty. Let's listen. He says, the First Crusade then was not about turning back centuries of Muslim expansion. It was about seizing control over sacred landscapes. It was, in modern parlance, a war of choice or an act of aggression. On July 15, 1099, this willfully chosen campaign ended victoriously when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. And it's really funny because I have some critics come up to me and say, oh, you shouldn't be quoting Jay Rubenstein. You know, that's one historian. Well, you guys quote Warner, so why can't I quote Jay Rubenstein? So Why the double standards? And in fact, I'm not even quoting a Muslim. So the guy is not even biased. So if I quoted a Muslim, you would have said, oh, that's biased. But when you quote a Christian, that becomes unbiased. But when I quote a non-Muslim, again, you're not happy with the sources and the references. And, it's amazing how hypocritical they are in their assertions. Now, folks, let's also bring this point up because I think it's very, very vital. Remember, he talked about it being defensive and so forth. But what does the Crusades represent? They represent Yahweh, or Jesus, as the Christians believe Jesus is God. This Jesus is apparently the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So when did this crusade begin? Did the Crusades begin when the advent of Christianity began? No, not really, because realistically, a crusader means someone who is fighting for God, someone who is a person who believes in the God of the Bible and so forth. Yet what we read in the Old Testament in the book of in the book of Samuel, which says, let's read the chapter 1 Samuel 15:3. It says, now go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, and children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So notice, what is their crime? Their crime is unbelief. What is their crime? Their crime is being sinful. Yet children and infants are being killed. What sin did they do that they had to be killed? So notice the Crusades, the Christian biblical Crusades, began much earlier in the peninsula, where it killed men, women, and children because they worshipped other gods. So the death count, don't let it start from the New Age Crusades. Let it start from the biblical Crusades, from the Old Testament, and you'll see they killed men, women, and children. And this is what they did even in Jerusalem, in the capture of Jerusalem. They again spared and killed men, women, and children. In fact, when Salahuddin recaptured Jerusalem, he actually told the Christian crusaders that they can leave in peace, in humility. They can leave, men, women, and children. He spared them. He said they could leave, and they did leave. You can even see it in the actual movie, The Kingdom of Heaven. So that was the Muslims. That was a Muslim morality, yet compare it to the Christian morality. And remember what I said, folks, remember what Bill Warner said? Bill Warner said, oh, these crusades are finished. I mean, this is the condescending view, folks. This is clearly condescending. These people want world domination through their new secular governments, which, like I said, 70% of their armies consist of devout Christians trying to spread the gospel and trying to fight for Jesus. In fact, there's a Christian company, there's an actual weapons company, it's called Trigicon, and I'll put a hyperlink below this video. On the military weapons of the Americans, they have inscriptions of biblical verses. Biblical verses fighting in Afghanistan, fighting in Iraq and so forth, that Jesus is the King of the world. These are the new crusades of our modern age. And it's interesting because they say, oh, look, they're not, spreading world domination to the rest of the world. They're not trying to take over the rest of the world. The Christian crusaders are not trying to do this. No, of course not. But yet, you ask them the question, for example, when America wants to take over North Korea, even they want to take over North Korea. And you ask the question, why can't America just mind its business? Well, why can't America mind their own business? Well, you can't if you want to remain the most dominant Christian nation in the world. If America wants to go after someone, it will A, pretend it has greater weapons than the world, pretend it wishes to strike America, and pretend its leader is like Hitler. Using these three methods of lies, it will try to win public opinion with biased one-side media propaganda, then strike that nation from ever progressing militarily and economically. This is how America keeps everyone in check. America calls North Korea president a cult leader and a man that wishes no peace. Yet all he wants to do is be able to test weapons to be able to defend itself. And this is the same America who invaded like 6 countries over the past 20 years, killing over 500,000 people. The West in fact says Islam wishes to take over the world, yet right under our noses, the West and its allies have taken over the world. The West can have as many nuclear weapons, do as many tests as it wishes, but everyone else needs to Big Brother's permission to defend itself. And then they say West wants peace, not global domination. These same guys are even thinking about one day going to war with China. Why? Simply because the country has expanded both economically and militarily. So please tell me who is wishing a global Khilafah, the Muslims or the West? You can see exactly who is wishing it. In fact, America now has more than 950 bases around the world, controlling it through air, space, ground, and so forth in the sea. So when these people want to say, oh, the Crusades are over, no. The Crusades are here with new uniforms.
Slave the kafir. So the next time you hear somebody talk about, oh, those dreadful Crusades, you've seen some facts about the matter. Why don't you pipe up and tell them you know you don't really know the matter?